went to India to study with her teacher, Swami
Dayananda
Saraswati, and in July he's going to be going back to India to study with him for another year before coming back to CIIS and starting his PhD in EWP in 2013. Matt Segall. Last time I introduced you, I said Segall, but now we're hearing it's Segall. Is a current PhD student in PCC, and he got his BA in cognitive science at University of Central Florida, and his master's in PCC as well. And his PhD topic, which seems to be shifting every few hours.
It's alive, so it's very protean. Yeah.
It is on
It's a
the
living creature.
imagination, specifically in Whitehead, Steiner, Coleridge, and Schelling. So we're expecting him to become a Schelling expert, and we get to see some of that stuff. Okay.
All right.
Yay.
Thank you. So James and I agreed that I would go first, and there are good things and bad things about that. But good because I won't have to respond to all the brilliant things that he says, and I can just stick to what I have prepared. Bad because, I have to break the ice. But whenever we try to talk about a non-dual philosophy, I think it's important to establish a sort of ethical groundwork. Every non-dual philosophy is non-dual to the extent that it's trying to bring us to the realization of something here and now, not an eternal truth that exists out there apart from you, but something that you can bring into practice. And Schelling didn't write much about ethics per se. He wrote a lot about freedom, but about ethical practice, he didn't really say too much. But I think his very style of doing philosophy reveals his ethical principles, which is in many ways an ethics that you could characterize as Alatheic. Aletheia is a Greek word that you could literally translate as truth, but it's more of a truth that uncovers itself. It's an unconcealment of the truth. And Schelling would be critical of other philosophers, but he would always try to respond to their critiques in such a way that it opened up room for a new realization that he could not have come to without having been critiqued by this other philosophical partner. So in this discussion about the differences and the similarities between Schelling and Shankara, I think it's an attempt to arrive at some shared understanding rather than an attempt to champion one as over and against the other. We're trying to allow something new to emerge in the conversation between these points of view. So that said, now we're going to draw a picture together. Schelling has what you could call a dynamic evolutionary panentheism. He has a picture of the Godhead that is a duality in unity, or you could say a tri-unity. These are different ways of talking about the same fundamental picture of God. Now, I'm going to try to draw this sequence of the Godhead self-realization and the pouring of the Godhead into the cosmos, and then the evolution of the cosmos back into a second iteration of God that is now fully actualized rather than the Godhead being sort of in this primordial state of possibility. So this is an infinitely dimensional, eternal event that I'm going to shrink into 2 dimensions in 10 minutes. So, forgive me. We'll begin with the Godhead and Schelling's theology. Hey guys. Schelling's theology is, it owes a lot to Jakob Böhme, who was a German shoemaker who died in 1625, somewhere around there, who was very unlearned and had this experience, this mystical encounter with the nature of God, the nature of the universe, and tried to articulate it in a very poetic and dense and difficult to follow alchemical language. Schelling takes that work of Burma's and tries to translate it into something clear and systematic and philosophical. So Schelling conceives of the Godhead as fundamentally a kind of duality, or polarity, perhaps is the better way to put it. The Godhead begins with these two principles, which I'll characterize as a dark circle and an open circle. This principle is a sort of centripetal, self-enclosing, almost selfish power or tendency in the Godhead to remain concealed and hidden and self-identical. Burma talks about this in terms of the taste of sourness. So think about that taste and the way that your whole body reacts to it by like sucking in like that. So this is that sucking in motion, that contraction. Right? So that's the first pole of the Godhead. The second pole is the opposite tendency, the tendency to expansion, to revelation, to manifestation. Burma talked about it as sweetness. So it's a sort of relaxing into and opening out into space, into expansion, into manifestation. So this is the opposite tendency here. Now, both of these tendencies in the Godhead are infinite. And so when you get one infinite force opposed by another infinite force, you end up with some kind of a unity which emerges between their activity, which is a third principle. So it's a duality and unity, or a tri-unity, because of the way that these two poles generate this third moment that holds them together in some way. And you could characterize what holds these two opposite poles together as love. Now, Schelling has this notion of polarity sort of characterizes every dimension of this process. So there's a whole nother element here that Schelling wants to throw in to make this what he would call all of this whole process the negative pole of God, and then the positive pole would be what he would call freedom. So God has one essential aspect to his nature, it's freedom, and the other necessary aspect of God, which is not free, is this whole process, which ends in love. So there's this principle, and then there's this overriding principle of God's freedom that sort of contains this. This one's dead. And this is where it gets interesting, because in some ways this second moment when God's freedom encompasses God's love, or this polarity, the freedom prevents this polarity from sort of running out of control. And so there's some kind of a essential relationship between freedom and love that is polar in the same way that this relationship is. So love becomes more of a self-love, and freedom becomes more of a sort of a desire to break free of that. And this is where it gets tricky with Schelling. So again, just to recap, this is what you could say is the self-realization of God in eternity. There's no time in this process. It's not like a sequence, though I had to draw it in sequence. This happens all at once. And it's this sort of dynamic, living self-creation of God in God's self. But then there's no cosmos yet. There's no time, there's no space, there's no matter. So from this moment of freedom, and Schelling wants to say that God's freedom overrides God's necessity. God freely chooses to create the world, and also the act of creation is sort of this gift, and this gift out of love to allow for there to be some other that God could then love. So though it's free, it's also necessary in some ways, because God isn't just a free will, but God is love. So this free choice to create the world is also propelled by this necessary love in the nature of God. But somehow this process spills out into the created world, into the cosmos. And the process of cosmogenesis unfolds in this, what Schelling will characterize as a series of stages in an evolutionary process. We call it cosmogenesis. And he thinks that matter isn't really other than the divine. So part of what pours out of the Godhead is matter. Part of what pours out is spirit. And in time, there are also these series of stages. Call this life. Call this psyche. And then sort of meeting this, again, it's the polarity again that emerges in this act of creation, right? Between matter and spirit. And then each of these levels inside try to unify that polarity. And I'm drawing a little bit from Steiner here, who's fully within this sort of Schellingian tradition, to call these upper levels here imagination and inspiration, which are sort of, if this is the natural and material level that pours out of the Godhead, this is the spiritual, the sort of mental dimension, and they're always in parallel, running together towards this omega point over here. So this would be alpha, and this omega point, which I'll get to in a minute, would be sort of the end of this process. And part of the reason, again, that God creates is in order to become more conscious, to become self-conscious, in fact. This is sort of the unconscious Godhead. So for Schelling, which may be a difference that James and I will unpack in Advaita Vedanta's conception of Brahman, for Schelling, the Godhead before creation and before this evolutionary process is unconscious. And through this process, God becomes conscious. In the Christian tradition, and Schelling sort of develops a philosophy within the context of this Christian mystical perspective. This moment could be characterized as the Father, which through the Father's free will and love creates the universe, which then evolves into, it always is the Son, right? But it evolves into the Son at the other end here. If you guys are familiar with Teilhard, I think most of everyone in this room is, it's very similar. And I'd have to admit that my reading of Teilhard has these other thinkers mixed in with it, but I do think that they are ultimately very similar. So somehow, this first moment of the Godhead in itself is unconscious and needs to pass through the universe and into, in this sort of incarnational process, into the universe in order to become fully conscious as this omega point. So,
I can ask you a question before you go on.
yes.
Can you repeat what you originally indicated about what I interpreted to be the sort of transcendent energy of freedom and its relationship to love in this paradoxical dialectic there?
Thanks for asking that. So, there's this paradoxical dialectical relationship between freedom and love. But if you do have freedom, absolute freedom, what is it for? Right? It's for love. And I think that there is therefore this relationship between free will and the capacity to love. Like if love was necessary and not free, it wouldn't really be love. So God's freedom is what makes God loving at the same time. Because if love was just sort of the necessary nature of God, which is what it is here without freedom, there's no life there. There's no need to meet an other in order to come into relationship. Love is relationship. And without two free beings who are not separate but are somehow distinct, love can't happen. So in the freedom to create this universe as initially something other to the Godhead, it's allowing a higher form of love to emerge than could have existed if God had just remained God. Because now there's this otherness, and God can come into relationship to an other and love in a free way rather than in a determined way. God can't help but love God's self, but when there's this other universe that pours out, now God has to love something that is so separate, or distinct at least, apparently separate. And it's through this evolutionary process that that apparent separation reconverges on the original unity that is now, in some ways, not the same as, but self-similar to, or made in the image of, you could say, God's original nature. So I'll just say one more thing, and then I'll pass the baton over to James, which is that the non-dualism, despite the fact that there does seem to be selfhood and otherness in this picture, the non-dualism comes through in Schelling's, rather mystical, theosophical in the original sense, not in terms of the 19th century Theosophical Society, but Brahma called his own work Theosophy. It's the wisdom of God. That, as Eckhart put it, when the human being thinks about this process, it's not an attempt to think of God as something outside of the universe or even outside of one's own consciousness, but as Eckhart put it, the eyes through which I see God are the very eyes through which God sees me. So there's that moment of unity and difference that emerges through that experience. And that though one would draw this process in two dimensions or try to think it conceptually and make it seem dualistic, it's ultimately an attempt to point to that essential unity between, as you might say in Advaita's language, Atman and Brahman. So I'll leave it at that and let James unpack Advaita for us a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Okay. The first thing I would like to say is that it's become obvious to me in this diagram, more obvious than it was from our discussion, how, or at least characterized, that it's, how different it is from Vedanta, from Advaita Vedanta.
Yeah.
Just the very idea that there's complexity, first of all, to the Absolute, that in some way it's inherent to it.
Yeah.
And that there's some kind of development of it are totally antithetical to Advaita Vedanta.
Right.
From the perspective of Advaita Vedanta, all there is Brahman, and Brahman is totally, fully actual and fully. It is in fact what consciousness is. Consciousness is existence, which is what Brahman is. So the idea that it has in any way something to become is totally foreign to it, because it's totally perfect as it is. And the manifest world, in all its plurality, doesn't touch Brahman in that sense. It is untouched. But this isn't to say that there's a negation of the empirical world of the creation, because it's certainly clear from what Shankara says, and I don't profess to be an expert on Shankara, but it's certainly clear that he does not negate the real world, and in fact, counterposes the position of Advaita Vedanta against the Yogacara school of Buddhism, for instance, any kind of subjective idealism. It's it's basically nonsensical, because the real world is met, it's there, and it has a reality in that sense. Shankara's cause, or reason for doing what he's doing, is not to lay out like a positive metaphysics or a positive system. Really, It's to try and make coherent how it can be the case, how that can be the case. How it can be the case that Brahman, which is described in the Upanishads, is one without a second, which means that for Advaita Vedanta, it means that it's totally undifferentiated, unchanging, and fully actual. And there is nothing other than it or to it. I've lost what I was saying. Where were they?
There's no otherness in Brahman.
Yeah.
No.
One without a second, right. So Shankara is trying to cohere how it can be the case that reality is one without a second in that sense, i.e. is Brahman, and also accommodate the brute fact of the empirical world, you know. Now, the kind of common way of understanding Vedanta and the caricature, from my point of view, is to talk about the world as Maya. There is a sense in which that is true, and that's really complicated how Maya is used in Vedanta. What's much better, what is used to describe the order of reality of the creation is mithya, which is defined as that which cannot be categorized as either real or unreal. Something slightly more extended than that, but basically that. Or otherwise defined as has a dependent reality. So it is to say that the creation has an existence, but that existence is relative. And insofar as it has existence, that existence just is Brahman. But this isn't a pantheistic system at all. It isn't to say that there's an identity, a straightforward identity. Because, I mean, the way that Carroll will always put it is that the creation or the empirical world is Brahman, but Brahman is not the creation of the empirical world. It is in a sense transcendent, but transcendent is a tricky word because it's not to say that it's other than or above or in any way other than that. It is the full actuality of it. So there's a sense in which all of what is understood here to be coming out of the Godhead here is to be coming out of the Godhead whilst at the same time being part of it and in some sense non-different from it. That is also, you can also see the distinction between the creation and Brahman in the same way. It is just that in no way do those particularities or the things that have come, that are manifest, in no way does that qualify Brahman. In other words, does that change it or make it, describe it in any way. So there is a kind of reduction in that sense. But I think that the key thing is that you know, when comparing Advaita Vedanta with any panentheistic, evolutionary panentheistic philosophy, is the idea, as Matt was pointing out, that is that definitely in Schelling and from what I understand in Hegel and elsewhere, that in some sense the Godhead or God is, or was rather, or you know, somehow outside of time, unconscious, and in some way it is doing something, you know, in order to become conscious or realize itself or whatever. From point of view of Advaita Vedanta, it's the complete opposite of that, really. It's there's no rejection of the fact that there is a sort of evolution of the creation, but that is not an evolution of you know, the Godhead or reality coming to know itself. It's an evolution of mithya, of the creation evolving means of, you know, reflecting the already self-evident reality of Brahman. There's no sense in which anything has to be done or achieved. And this is a problem. This is a massive difference and a massive problem, because ultimately where that ends up is, you know, for instance, in how you were talking about it, in terms of love being not necessary in the system, and it can't be necessary. There has to be some freedom involved. For Vedanta, you could definitely, you know, you could talk of Ananda, which is one of the designators of Brahman, as love. A better word to describe it is fullness. And that's absolutely necessary. It's a part of it already, and therefore
Right.
that as would be the consequence in the system that you're talking about, that negates there being any telos really, and that feeds, or that's a great segue into the fact that into the central idea in Advaita Vedanta that the problem is avidya, is ignorance, is not recognizing what was already fully the case. You know, there's an evolution of ignorance. You could possibly say, you know, an evolution of ignorance's dissolution, so that what is already true and real is seen for what it is. The most important point, though, I think, to make about Advaita Vedanta, which is something that is not picked up from looking at it philosophically and from thinking about it philosophically, and certainly from reading philosophical texts about it, is just it needs to be constantly reiterated that what is being talked about is the very truth of your experience as it is now. That's there in the system, which is to say that Atman equals Brahman, but that sounds very abstract, and it is abstract. It's not. Even though you're talking about the Atman self, it still sounds like it's some other self, some other person, some other thing to be, some other thing to become. And in the same sense that the Brahman has nothing to become, the Atman has nothing to become, and it is a case of realizing or recognizing, of overcoming ignorance, of the mind being able to remove the mind removing its own ignorance to see reality, and that's the only sense in which there's any kind of process of realization. It's a personal realization, and it's an as-if realization, because it's a realization. It's an act of the mind, and it isn't, and the consequence isn't a consequence for the mind. It's if ignorance is removed, what is already self-shining, what is already self-luminous, is just there, and it was realized never to not have been there. So there's really no way in which you can say that really anything is happening, I don't think, in that sense. So yeah, I think that's, how long is that?
Yeah. You have a question? Go for it. Yeah.
So I'm just, I was trying to contemplate maybe a synthesis of two perspectives, and if it's possible to precede Schelling's cosmology with Brahman. So in a sense that the Christian God is like is the highest level of personality that can be, whereas Brahman doesn't seem to be personal and have direction or desire. So in Genesis it says the Spirit of God hovered over the waters, and there's this idea of this chaos or potentiality being organized by the Spirit of God. And so perhaps we could say that the waters are the Brahma or Brahmin, I can't remember. Brahmin. Or the Brahmin, and then Christianity kind of like as this emergence out of that, and then you get this very particular personalized cosmology from there. Is that?
Yeah.
And I don't know if that would be like heretical to Christianity, or just, or if maybe the Advaita Vedanta just rationally you have to come to these conclusions of how things could be the way they are. It seems very more rational than revealed. I don't know.
It would certainly, I think it would be heretical to the sort of mainstream of the Christian tradition, but that's wonderful, because heresy, it provokes the further development of our understanding. Some heresies are true.
It just means outside of
outside of,
just means
right?
Outside of.
But always, what's inside the tradition has to respond to what's outside, and there are inquisitions is one way of doing it. not the best way, then there's also conversation.
I don't think that to think of it that way, and we wouldn't have to call in Christianity, you wouldn't have to call it Brahman. You could just maybe call it Holy Spirit, or you could call it the Ein Sof, or some. I don't think it would be. You wouldn't lose any theological orthodox theology by supposing that. Perhaps, but I don't know. That's what. So that's what I'm
all this is Brahman.
Well, or Brahman is just prior. Where you can't say any of this in Brahman.
Yeah.
You can't. But once Brahman becomes actualized in some sort of personality, then all of Christianity unfolds out of that.
Yeah, I think there's a dangerous sense in which that can always be true. I mean, from Advaita, from the perspective of Advaita Vedanta, all these kind of theological philosophies can totally be accommodated within the idea of Ishvara, because Ishvara has another, basically a synonym for the creation is Ishvara, which is the Lord. It has more of a sort of, it's like Saguna Brahman with qualities, but it has a sense of intelligence and a sense of, deity about it. Personalities, yeah. But, and I don't think there's any reason why you can't accommodate these ideas within that, and I think that you can definitely do that, and that's something I was interested in doing with regards to Whitehead. But I think ultimately it comes down to the fact that if you're doing that, it wouldn't really be. It would be a one-way accommodation, if you know what I mean, because there's no way, there's no room in Advaita to allow for any sort of
change in the balance.
Any sort of anything with regards to Brahman. There can be nothing brought in. You can certainly say that whatever's being talked about here or elsewhere is part of Ishvara, but it just wouldn't touch Brahman.
Hold the audience. Just so you,
oh, it's fine. I think it's... Yeah. Well, I think Caleb brought up something important, and that Ishvara, it even sounds like, I think it's Aramaic for Jesus, Yeshua. Yeshua. And I don't know if that's just a coincidence or if there is some etymological. Is it? No, nothing whatsoever. Darn.
Aramaic is not an Indo-European language.
Okay. But this idea that morphic fields, fuck that. One thing I didn't mention as regards to personality is that Schelling talks about freedom as the personality of God, the personal element of God. That it's sort of the living, dynamic, spontaneous element of God that is that has characteristics and like a personality. And that this side of God is kind of like God's unconscious. So it's in the manifestation of the cosmos and the evolutionary process towards the omega, God's personality is realizing itself as fully as it can possibly be realized. Whereas God in itself, without that free choice to create the universe, would just be a simple substance, no complexity, which seems to be how Brahman is described. It's just sort of without any characteristics, no dynamism, no polarity, certainly, right? So if this whole thing is a characterization of Ishvara, of the personality of God, then we could accommodate Christianity, or Schelling's Christianity, to Advaita by saying that Brahman is behind this whole process, and also not this process in some important way, that this is the evolution of ignorance, as you put it, which is an interesting way of talking about it. And in some ways, you could also characterize this as the evolution of ignorance from, unconsciousness to self-consciousness, and where you have unconscious love in the Godhead, and sort of at the beginning of the universe, let's say, even though it was the beginning of time also, there's unconscious freedom, and what happens at the omega is that freedom and love both become self-conscious. Right. But I think there may be an impasse here as to whether or not we can characterize Brahman as changing
Yeah,
in any way.
which you certainly can't. Yeah.
I mean, Schelling is clear that he wants the divine to be dynamic and alive
Yeah.
in the way that it isn't just a simple ultimate, absolute, but somehow a dynamic, relational divinity.
Yeah, well, I think an interesting thing in that regard is sorry, what did you say?
See, well, that's the thing, right? I'm trying to remember, in the process of whatever I just said, I'm trying to remember that non-dual realization that's always eluding us every time we try to say something. But what I said was that there would be an impasse because Brahman can't change.
Yeah.
And Schelling's God would want to be alive, dynamic, somehow
Yeah.
incomplete in some interesting way.
Yeah.
That it
okay.
needs another, and it needs
Yeah.
to be in relationship to something outside of itself.
Yeah. So the interesting thing there to me is whether they're in fact asking the same questions in that regard. Like as I was trying to say at the end of what I said,
Yeah.
of coming back to that very primary thing in Advaita Vedanta, of talking about the very truth of yourself. It's the question of whether they're in fact talking about the same thing, and whether in fact, Schelling or to be honest, anybody else that's talking about, the world or the creation, anything that is objective, is necessarily talking about that. And really, to talk of Brahman is not to say this is the Godhead and this negates that Godhead. It's to say it's really there's a sense in which I'm getting the feeling that they're really different things, and you could certainly have a dialogue between this and Ishwara, but I don't think that would achieve the same purposes, because I think fundamentally there, the fact that Atman and Brahman are identified, and that's the most important thing, just makes it a very different project and a very different idea.
Right.
And unless there's going to be some, talk of what's, the non-objective truth of whatever is objective, which then becomes a subjective inquiry, then they're really existing in different categories.
Yeah.
But
Well,
yeah.
I want to bring Schelling directly into the conversation by just reading two aphorisms that he published in 1805 about precisely what you're saying about the relationship of subject and object. And it's to me, this seems most like Advaita of anything else I've read in Schelling. So he says, not we, this is a section about what it means to know the absolute. So he says, not we, neither you nor I know about God. For insofar as reason affirms God, it cannot affirm anything else, and thus at once annihilates itself as something particular, as something outside of God. In truth, and as such, there is no subject at all, and no I, and therefore also no object or non-I, but only one, God, or the all, and nothing else. If therefore there is any knowing at all, and any being known, then whatever is in either is still only the one as one, that is, God. So
That really does sound like...
that sounds like something Shankara would say.
Yeah, which is, so I mean, it's very difficult to see how exactly you can reconcile.
It comes down to Schelling not wanting the world to be Maya.
Yeah.
That the world is in fact the laboratory where the divine is working out something new.
But the problem is...
What?
It doesn't sound like what you just said. Because there's nothing new in anything.
It's yeah, I mean, there's some kind of mystery where eternity, the nature of the Godhead in itself, enters into and participates fully with time.
Mm-hmm.
That Schelling and the whole Christian theosophical tradition is trying to bring together. And I don't think it's other than what Advaita is doing on some level, because I mean, you can characterize it this way. If there is an infinite Godhead, what is the relationship of finitude to that infinity? You know, if we were going to draw the infinite as just, you know, it's an infinite circle whose circumference is nowhere, is finitude like some section of it over here? No. Because if you're going to draw a boundary in the infinite, you've limited it.
Yeah.
So the finite must be fully possessed of or manifest through the infinite.
Mhm.
The finite must in some way be infinite, which still doesn't explain what it is that allows God to become self-conscious in a way that God wasn't as just the infinite without finitude.
Mhm.
But, I mean, that's the, as Steiner calls it, that's the mystery of Golgotha. That's the mystery
Yeah.
of the death and resurrection of Christ.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, that element, which is a historical event that's supposed to represent this eternal process, is always this stumbling block in Christianity,
Mhm.
and on one level, but because it does distinguish it from Advaita in this essential way, I think.
I think the problem is, as far as I can see it, is that if you're talking about something that is pre-subject-object, well, obviously there's no spatial terms pre-subject-object,
Right.
but something that is logically prior to subject and object, then you have to then be talking about anything that includes duality. It must, in some sense, must be figurative. If you're talking about what is pre-subject-object, in the sense we're talking about, if that's what you define as truth, which is certainly what is defined as truth in Vedanta, then anything that is constituted by duality necessarily becomes figurative, necessarily becomes Maya, but not Maya.
Right.
But necessarily becomes in some sense
Yeah.
figurative, and that's really the whole reason for it. If you're going to talk about something that is truly transcendent of subject and object, or logically prior, or however you want to put it,
Mm-hmm.
you're really logically led into into the most meaningful way of discussing reality, or the most practical way of discussing reality, and that's important because it's what is practical is most important here in Vedanta, is to talk about it in a figurative sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that when you talk of the creation as Maya, when you talk of Maya, I think that there's definitely, it definitely has to be true in some sense that, but it definitely is true in some sense that, the focus in Advaita Vedanta is not the systematic explanation of existence, and to some extent it's just like Maya,
Right.
that at least how it's caricatured, at least keeping it
Mm-hmm.
contained without
Right.
going off into all these other things.
Yeah.
So there can be a much more sophisticated explanation of it, but I think from its perspective, it can only be that. It can only be figurative in some sense.
Yeah.
And
Well, there's one way that Advaita characterizes the creation or the manifest cosmos as Maya, but then there's also Lila, play rather than illusion, and that characterizing it as play is, Hegel himself says, Hegel had been in conversation with Schelling up to this point, but in the Phenomenology of Spirit in 1807, Hegel writes that the universe is spirit disporting or at play with itself. And that ultimately this distinction between subject and object, or self and other, is play. It's a kind of drama.
Yeah.
But it's upon this stage that something essential is worked out that couldn't have been worked out within the Godhead itself. So
Yeah.
that God's playfulness is in the service of something transformative and transfiguring about the nature of the Godhead itself. And you could say that when you arrive at that endpoint, at that omega, you're returning to where you began, but as if for the first time, right?
Yeah.
As T.S. Eliot put it. But, so everything has changed, but nothing has changed. And, Niels Bohr said that one profound truth, the opposite of one profound truth is another profound truth. And that somehow in contradiction, you arrive at the paradoxical nature of reality, and yet it seems to, on the face of it, be completely nonsensical.
Yeah.
And you end, I mean, this is why ultimately philosophy needs to open out into poetry, or, you know, if you're not performing the truth in this more inactive, embodied way, but rather just trying to describe it,
Mm-hmm.
you will inevitably fail.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting. My own reading of Advaita, which I think it turns out isn't an unfair reading of it,
Yeah.
is that how you're talking about, you know, poetry and enacting the truth for Vedanta, and this ties into the idea of the purpose of the idea of Leela, is that you know, any action, any instantiation of anything is automatically a coming away from Brahman. Is automatically a not that.
Yeah.
So there's no, you know, any kind of process, any kind of becoming, any kind of change is all categorically contained within itself, and so there's no sense in which, even in a poetic sense, even in the most intuitive sense, there's no sense in which reality can be brought forth or brought out. Just going back to, you know, just reiterating what I was already saying, because it's already fully there. So it really does totally restrict the whole purpose to recognition. It's just a simple case of recognition,
Right.
and there isn't anything else to do other than that.
Which is the interesting thing about play. If the universe is about Leela, and this spirit just playing with itself, play isn't purposeful in the sense that it has a definite end. You know, it's play is that unique sort of activity where the ends and the means are the same. You know, it's like a self-fulfilling activity that doesn't need anything outside of itself. But it's almost as if there's a sort of serious play working itself out through this evolutionary process where there is an end. And Schelling talks about the fall, you know, in the Christian sense of, you know, because there is freedom, because the human being has freedom, we have the freedom not to love, just as much as the freedom to love, so that there is the sort of glitch in the process of evolution that it's sort of like the trickster element that raises the possibility of evil existing. If you have freedom, you have the possibility of evil.
Yeah.
But there's the redemption too. So the fall isn't permanent and in any way irrevocable.
Yeah.
So there's these two, you know. But I think it's about 7:30, and hopefully you all are interested in asking us questions and adding whatever has emerged for you as we've been discussing this. So, Clara?
This is a really simple one, I think. I know I got here late, but what do you mean by figurative? When you were saying just in a figurative way or in a figurative sense, as opposed to...
Not literal, you know, not, you know, but, you know, like, it in some sense, it doesn't have an absolute reality.
Okay.
You know, it's not...
Or an abstract concept, or...
Yeah, so in the same sense in which what?
No. I'm answering the question, but you're the one who's really...
yeah, I guess, I mean, it's the relationship of something that's concrete and actual to something that's abstract.
Right.
But it's not to say that the creation or that order of reality is abstract. It's just to say it has a similar relationship in the sense of it's not ultimately real. It only has an existence insofar as it is what is ultimately real.
Yeah. What I heard you saying by figurative is that whenever we speak and use language, it inevitably falls into this subject-object duality.
Yeah.
And that any attempt to characterize the nature of reality will be figurative because of that, the basic structure of language. Whatever you say can't be literally...
But I think this is the important point, the basic structure of existing. It's not just language, it's existing. It's action. It's becoming itself.
Yeah.
Language is only a...
reflection
an
of that.
an analogy almost of becoming. And becoming is the problem, really. That is what avidya is. It's cosmological. It's inherent in existing itself. There's existence, and existing is always an acting out of existence, and therefore in ignorance.
I mean, avidya and the fall, or sin, which normally sin is like you're bad in some moral, ethical sense, but sin is also a kind of lack of knowledge, a kind of ignorance, which there seems to be a similarity between what avidya is and what sin is and is characterized as.
Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that?
Yeah.
Actually, I have a lot of questions for you. I'll try to contain myself. So if Brahman is all, is consciousness, then I consistently come up against what feels like a lack of logic to me to then make statements about figurative existence or ignorance. So if you're going to make that statement, then that means Brahman is figurative and is ignorant. To be logically consistent, right?
What do you mean? Because you're saying...
Because Brahman
is everything,
And so, and Atman is equivalent to Brahman.
Yeah.
But yet, only in Atman does there exist ignorance. No?
Ignorance is of the very nature of... This is very subtle, very tricky, but it's of the nature of existing itself, and that's a stupid way of putting it, really, but like the act of existence, insofar as there is an act, and that's what's thought of as figurative. That is the problem. Like avidya is not located in the individual. It's not like a cognitive issue. I mean, it is as well, but it just... I mean, that's a whole other thing. But I think what you were saying with the question is, if there is absolute non-duality, then how can there be ignorance of it?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's like the perennial problem with Vedanta. I don't actually feel qualified to answer that, because ultimately it's like, the very purport of the teaching methodology is to show you why that's the case, and you have to have shraddha, belief that is the case.
I'd like to add something to this particular question. I'm doing this sort of from a Buddhist perspective, where, so the question, if I may repeat the question, if being, which is all there is absolute consciousness, then how is there any such thing as ignorance? How is it possible? And one way of addressing this is to turn the question back to ignorance and try to find its essence, to try to actually see ignorance. And from a Buddhist perspective, if we carry out a very disciplined, perhaps lifelong or multi-lifelong investigation as to the true nature of ignorance, we don't ever find it. In fact, the essence of ignorance is wisdom itself. So there never was any ignorance. So your question is actually nonsensical. It's sort of grammatically incorrect. And so now that's not something that is sort of real obvious. It's the outcome of a long experiential process of cultivation. But so this leads to another thing which is important with regard to the nature of personhood, which I agree with Caleb is a really crucial distinction and kind of hinge point for this whole discussion. In Buddhist sutras, we have the Buddha teaching on Atman, the emptiness of the self, in some places, but then in other places, he speaks about people. He speaks in personal terms. So there's a question, well, is he contradicting himself? And the tradition couldn't tolerate that. So then the question is, well, what do we do with this? And so a distinction is made between statements whose meanings need to be drawn out, we call that nayarta, and then statements of definitive meaning or nitarta. And that later, so that's a hermeneutical category that later gets kind of brought into metaphysics to distinguish between what we call relative and absolute reality. So we can have persons and we can have processes of development, we can have objects and we can have personalities and we can have unconscious and conscious and all these other things. But the point is that those are concepts that are produced along a kind of path of coping. They are sort of adventitious, sort of patina, okay? But then when their meaning is drawn out, we don't find them anymore.
Yeah. Is this like upaya? Like this, it's skillful means?
Well, no, we haven't gotten to upaya yet. It's different than that. Because, see, upaya is unobstructed. But in our normal kind of day-to-day coping with things, we constellate things conceptually. And then we get wrapped up in that and we forget that all it ever was a kind of practical sort of coping. And that is ignorance. That's a belief in a personal self, etc., etc. So, see, personal theists like to criticize Vedanta or Advaita Vedanta by saying, oh, this Brahman, this absolute being you're talking about is just the lowest common denominator. And what we're really interested in is the apex of reality, which is the personal. But a non-dualistic response to that is to say, where is the person, ultimately? Show me the person. Establish the person. And then the non-establishment of the person becomes manifest over a long experiential process of meditative cultivation. And that is the ultimate. So I feel like this conversation could benefit from a pretty rigorous distinction of relative and absolute here.
Yeah.
So that
Well-
leads me to, sorry if I can just say, like, and a follow-up to that, the other important question I feel like I have is why creation? Through the lens of Advaita Vedanta.
Good question.
If it's
Yeah,
just-
well, I mean, it turns out to be ultimately meaningless, because ultimately there is Brahman that is absolute full satisfaction, and it's just a question of recognizing that, and existence really is just an erring away from that, and that's the sense in which Leela is used, that once one has self-knowledge and sees all this as Brahman, sees Brahman as your very self and this, there is no purpose, there is no telos to all of this. It's just a question of acting, and then get into the dharma and just acting for the good, for the good of the situation, for good of people and whatever. There is no grand reason or plan. There certainly isn't a temporally extended telos. That's for sure.
So the point I was trying to make, real quick, the point I was trying to make is that it's not that the creation or the manifestation is meaningless, it's that the question is meaningless.
Yeah.
The question why creation is meaningless.
Yeah, well,
from the product of a long process of experiential cultivation is the understanding of that.
True, but it's not. But at least from the perspective of Vedanta, it's not inherently okay, it is inherently meaningless, but it has.
Yeah, because there's no reference.
But it has meaning within and for duality. It's a dualistic question.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
On the relative level.
So it has a meaning, but ultimately, yeah.
But ultimately, the question resolves.
It's a better way of,
There's
better
no
way of
answer
putting
to
it.
the question. There's
Yeah,
the dissolution of the question, and that's the ultimate level of reference.
Yeah.
But in the system you're presenting, that's...
I want to ask a question straight.
Beginning, middle, and end.
Yeah.
Can I get a second for Daniel?
Sure. I want to just say, as an answer to why, from Schelling's point of view, this is what differentiates Schelling from other German idealists. Schelling criticizes Hegel for, developing an understanding of what the universe must be given the nature of what God is, but Schelling says that Hegel doesn't explain why God would create. There's nothing in Hegel's system which describes the essence of God and the essence of nature that explains why nature should exist at all. So Schelling's after that, the answer to that question, like why is it that there is anything at all? So he's after the thatness of creation rather than the whatness, right? And he says logic can't explain that. So instead, this is why freedom, the freedom of the Godhead, is so important to Schelling, that there is a world is because God is free and because God is love. And so God creates the world not because there's something necessary about that act, but because that's the nature of love, to freely create as a gift. And it's not like a gift to something other than God. It's almost like,
See, that's
gracious.
See, that's one problem with this
Yeah.
system.
yeah, yeah. So
And you're like, he doesn't think it can be logically explained, but let me go ahead and use all this logic to explain it.
and then he says philosophy is an unending task. But
Well,
yeah,
I think it's kind of more clear from the Segall perspective what's going on. You're seeing something, you're like, what's this all happening? Well, I'm going to impose this idea that it's this movement from unconsciousness to consciousness.
right.
And then that's why. And James mentioned at some point that there was also the project of explain how you come face to face with this existence and its changing evolutionary nature when you have this Brahman. And you were like, his project is to kind of explain that. And I didn't feel like you really did. And then there was some discussion where it just dissolves. And then and then there's this play with using words like Maya and Leela, but dissolving the problem doesn't really. I mean, yeah, that's satisfying in one way, but then let's just start with there's no problem versus, yeah, here's the problem and here's how I'm going to explain it by there's no problem. It seems like there's several unnecessary steps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
Whereas yours makes sense, and I feel like at the crux of it all is that there's the Godhead, and it kind of begs the question, like, what is this infinite force that time as of nature has, that it can come in and schism God between these two poles of God? Like, time almost seems more important here than God, that can be divided by time. And then that begs the question of, like, why God wasn't conscious to begin with, if he was really God. And then, so the time seems to be the issue, and I feel like the nature of the two philosophies is, what do you believe? Do you believe that something that evolves becomes something that it wasn't? Or do you believe that something that evolves becomes something that it always was? And the answer to that question is really profound, I think, and whether or not it would be different. And then when you have looking at time, looking at it all in a temporal framework, like, does it make sense? Is there any validity then to thinking of time as the totality of that whole process? Because the paradox comes in when you try to look at the whole thing in one chunk, and then you get like the Eastern stuff. No, it was all one, it was always happening.
Yeah.
Or you try to look at it just in the moment, the instantaneous moment of time, and then you get this process,
Right.
which is really powerfully explanatory.
Right. Well,
It seems like these two visions, like, what is time? Is it moment or is it total?
let me say something really quick.
Well, I just want to tag
Oh,
on to
okay,
that.
that's fine.
Because with the first part of Schelling's, like the three powers of Schelling's God, I asked Jake about this several months ago because I was struggling with it, and the impression I got from him is that is happening outside of time.
Yeah. Well,
The first three.
The first three.
yes, but
And then that begs the question,
or yes,
why would
and.
the atemporal Godhead be unconscious, really? That seems to me.
I mean, it's not as clear as that it's just outside of time, because I've heard commentators on Schelling saying that what Schelling is doing is bringing time into the Godhead itself, bringing time into eternity itself.
Outside of time builds a duality, then
Right.
now you're in dual,
But
time and outside time.
this question of, I mean, you began your remark by saying that in Advaita there's this tendency to want to dissolve the question, to show that they're never, ignorance, when you look at its true nature, is not anything.
And how is that not Maya?
But dissolution, to dissolve, I like the alchemical metaphor, because that can carry over into what Schelling is trying to do, which is not to dissolve anything, but to make gold out of baser metals.
But how can you do that if those metals were always gold and it's just
Yeah, you're
an
just finding
illusion
out
of
that it
your
was always
subjective
gold.
You're finding out that it was,
And so, relatively speaking, it's alchemical.
Right. I
Absolutely,
mean,
it was always.
you add sulfur and mercury or whatever else, and it leads to gold. So somehow in those base metals, gold must have been there already. Yes.
Time is the key there.
But yeah, it's a
You need
time. It's a time.
to turn
It's
something that was already gold.
it's a developmental process. Yeah.
But it seems like the two philosophies are almost identical in a lot of ways, except they're grappling with these words like Brahman and Atman and Self and Godhead and Alpha and Omega. And really, there's just one issue, and it's time.
Time.
And it's whether or not you believe it's all happening at once,
Yeah.
or it's happening in sequence, or those two are identical, or
Yeah. This is. I mean, like Whitehead, Schelling's picture is a process theology, a process ontology.
yeah.
But
So
it's
that-
participatory, that's the
Yeah,
major
where is the novelty?
Whitehead
There's-
is definitely
it's
participatory.
they're both
paradoxical.
participatory. You mean the difference between Whitehead and Schelling, or?
No.
White,
Yeah, I thought you were
between
saying
process
participatory.
and non-dualistic stuff.
Oh, right. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that participatory element is saying that there is some kind of otherness and some kind of identity, and like they interact and they co-create. The notion of co-creation is what participatory thought is, the
So I mean, if
participatory
there's novelty,
paradigm.
does that deny the possibility of looking at the whole process as from outside? Because how can you can't, I mean, if you could look at it all at once,
Yeah,
then how can there be novelty? So it almost
Right.
seems that there's a mutual exclusivity between the concept of novelty and
yeah.
where you would have novelty in the West and you wouldn't have it in the East. There is no novelty because the problem is everything, and
Right.
it's an illusion to pretend that we're not where that.
Like Caleb said at the beginning, Genesis, the book of Genesis starts with the primordial waters, chaos, and then the Spirit of God sort of brings forth a universe, sort of asking. There's different characterizations. Some Christian theologians will say it was by fiat, that God just said, you must make this universe in this way. And others, there's like the Elohim is the word used for God, and it's a grouping, it's a multitude, a plurisingularity.
Godhead.
That's Eckhart.
God, yeah, that's Eckhart. That's different. But it's the Elohim is sort of a choir of angels that are participating, cooperating with one another to create out of chaos. And chaos is what Whitehead means by creativity. It's novelty. It's perpetual, dynamic, unsettled motion or something. It's not like going anywhere, but it's just always churning and changing. And the change is the fundamental root of everything, rather than full presence.
Yeah.
And my point was really along these lines. I asked Anna if I could botch right now, but
Oh.
the ethical regardless.
Yeah.
Thank you, appreciate it. But if you want to have the same idea of this Brahman and Godhead being the same, if that is identical, you're still both left with the problem. How does all this come? Where does this come from? And so Advaita Vedanta.
Advaita.
Vedanta.
Write it up.
Yeah, that would be helpful for me.
Actually, could you write up the other term, the one that wasn't Maya?
Midday.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'd like you to write up the term that you first referenced to.
Is that spelled right? Advaita?
Yeah.
Yeah.
AV. I like the Vedanta.
Yeah.
The solution says, well, everything here isn't, I assume, isn't real.
Right.
Whereas the Christian idea is like God has desire, and so these are both trying to offer solutions on how do you explain our phenomenal experience.
That's not a solution. Like, the Western one is the solution. Like, here's the question.
Well,
That-
no,
that-
you have to.
He's less talking
I
to
think
really.
I think it's like, how do you explain this experience if it's Maya?
Well, no, it's explicitly said to be inexplicable. It's putting at the front.
Okay,
and I
well,
take that
that's
to be
an
a positive.
explanation. You can't do
Yeah.
it.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that's-
okay.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
so we have the inexplicable explanation, and then we have one that says, oh, God desires this to happen and create a teleos
Yeah.
and a drama, a story with a beginning and a middle and end. And
Yeah.
I mean, these are two explanations
But-
for what my experience is, even though I'm being told. See, here's the problem is my experience is totally contradictory to this idea that God is this
Unnecessarily
Brahmanic,
so.
right? And so you have to lead me somehow to this point of, because that's totally foreign and irrational to me. So instead of going back, instead of starting with Brahman and getting the experience,
Yeah.
I have to start with my experience, right, and get back to Brahman. And so I don't get that. And I hear what I hear from Aaron is that you have to do a lot of work to get there, right? And it's not.
Yes, and then in tantric traditions, you start immediately with the experience of wisdom, and then you work to integrate it over time. And so it's a direct introduction, and so lineage becomes very important. I personally think that lineage is a huge thing that's been missing from this discussion. Because the actual transmission of Vedantic wisdom occurs through lineage, not through text or words or concepts. That's the point. Also, another thing that's important, since we have the word Advaita, we all know the word dual, which has this relationship via Indo-European with dva. Advaita means not two. So it's not saying that it's one, that everything's
Not two,
one.
yeah.
It's saying it's not two.
It's a negative theology.
It's not this,
Yeah.
neti neti. So it's not, so that's the thing. Wisdom dawns. It doesn't require any kind of conceptual establishment. Concepts, sort of elaborations, exhaust themselves. That's the play. Confusion dawns as wisdom.
Yeah, that's more a Buddhist understanding.
That's true.
Like,
Sorry, yeah.
You know, as Stephen made the distinction between Advaya and Advaita. You know, certainly in Advaita Vedanta, Advaita is categorically positive and real,
Right,
and it's an absolute statement of that. And it's not like, it's not saying there's not two. It's saying, you know, there is one.
Yeah.
Well, isn't Christianity a lineage? Isn't that?
Well, I mean, yeah, and even Schelling wasn't just reading texts. There were two figures that were really important to him when he was a teenager. I forget their first names, but Odinger and Hahn who were it's called Swabian pietism. It's a kind of Protestant Christianity, and they certainly had read Burma, just like Schelling read Burma, but they claimed to have had these experiences themselves and to in some way have been initiated into the mystery that Burma wrote about. So that Schelling, you know, these were childhood friends that died before he even became a famous philosopher, but he kind of, I think you could say, was initiated into this way of being with the mystery by these figures, Odinger and Hahn, so that it wasn't just Schelling reading texts and trying to reconstitute them in the microwave or something. He was in the presence of gurus. Yeah. But Adam's been waiting patiently.
Yeah, there's a couple things, couple compliments, thank you. That's a compliment. And then there's also another compliment. Maybe this is just an ecological observation, but I notice how if I turn my head like to the horizontal, it's almost as if you've drawn a flower there, the bulb, and then the tulip is sort of emerging, and I like the organic feel of this. Maybe there's an ecology there, maybe as well. And you know, things take time to grow, and and then I was, you know, I've been coming back to this notion of experience during the conversation, and how do I practice my way into a living experience of the sacred or of the divine, and I think, I mean, Aaron referenced this in terms of, you know, there's a lineage to practice which invokes an experience of a dissolving of ignorance, so that we can experience the illumination of reality or the sacred or Brahman or something. So I was going to ask you what are your practices in terms of there was something else I was going to say too, but I love that.
That's a good question.
My practice and the practice of Advaita Vedanta in the tradition in which I'm in, which is a distinction needs to be made as well between this and, you know, Neo-Advaita of Swami Vivekananda and all this kind of thing. They're different. This is the tradition, I guess, that I'm in is very true to Shankara. It's very strictly Shankarian. And as a result, as opposed to with Swami Vivekananda, there's no sense in which there's an experience to be had or there's something to do. You know, so meditation isn't necessary. You know? It's something that I do, and it's something that's done, and it's something, guided meditation is something that Carol does in the classes that I take, and that's important, but more to put yourself into a state into a sense, give yourself a sense of quiescence in which you can absorb the instruction of the teacher. So really, it's about that, and it's about going to what is essentially class with Carol, and she'll read some kind of secondary text, and talk of a particular stotra or whatever paragraph, and then do a Vedantic unfoldment. So she will basically be describing reality as it appears to her. So that there's a hugely important sense in which of the transmission, because you're being led along with her to try and see experience as she sees experience. So it's like almost a co-exploration. It's every week it's the same thing, talking about the same thing. And to begin with, it's like, I understand clay pot. You know what I mean? Clay pot, clay pot, clay pot, clay pot. It keeps on going on about clay pot, and I realised that it's just, you're being shepherded the whole time to try and see what she's seeing. So that's the practice. And outside of that, doing things to encourage the capacity, encourage your capacity to follow that shepherding is encouraged and is done, such as meditation, such as living a dharmic life, and studying in your own time. But really, it's fundamentally, strictly Shankarian. It will be talked about, and so it's about an intellectual recognition, a discriminative recognition. So really, it's just about trying to discriminate and making minor discriminations on the way, which, at least for the time being, appear as if something is happening and it's helping in some way. But really, it's just getting into a state in which through the grace of Ishvara, you are bestowed with the vision of yourself as you really are.
But it's renunciatory, right? Or is that very depending on the tradition?
Well, yeah, it is. In India, if you want to, for Carol, it's not. So, yeah, it's not necessary. You don't have to do that. But, it is renunciatory. People take sannyasa as a matter of course if they want to be a serious student. But, most Westerners don't seem to do that. And the Westerners that I have seen do that kind of look a bit stupid.
Yeah.
In orange robes,
I was also really interested in one more question, and I wanted to bring it back to you, Matt, and say the first word I actually wanted you to write on the board, but the first concept that you seemed to flesh out, I found to be really fundamental, and it was the
Alatheic ethics.
This.
Yeah.
Could you speak about this, the Alatheic ethics?
Yes.
A little bit more.
And then I want to answer the practice question too. But
yeah.
I was going to bring up the Alatheic ethics, and again, Aletheia, Greek word, means sort of the unconcealedness of the truth, or coming to the truth as something which unfolds before us without our active imposition. It's not like we're discovering something ourselves, but it's sort of great. It's like a unforgetting. Letha, the river Letha, a Greek myth. You drink from it, you forget. Aletheia was to unforget. Thank you. To remember. And in terms of thinking about what ignorance is forgetfulness. And what's interesting about how Schelling wants to find unconsciousness in the Godhead itself, or ignorance in some way in the Godhead itself, is to point out this sort of recursive link between remembering and forgetting. To remember, you need to forget, right? There needs to be a letting go of what you, had been thinking to make room for what it is you're trying to remember. So there's some polar relationship between remembering and forgetting, between ignorance and gnosis. And so an Alatheic ethics is an attempt to, through conversation, through discourse, as a practice, I would say, to make room for the truth to emerge between whoever is engaging in conversation, rather than it being a situation where I arrive at dialogue with a conception of the truth that I'm going to defend in an attempt to refute whatever the other party has to present. Instead, I arrive in a humbler way, in some sense with faith in the genius of language and discourse itself, not as my possession, but as something we share, to make manifest or to help us all to remember in conversation. And that speech is never just a speaking, speech is also a hearing, a listening. And then if you think of language as an organ of perception, it binds the mouth and the ears together so that both of those, the receptive and the active, are necessary to bring forth truth. So that's the Alatheic ethics. And then in terms of practice, I mean, there's an element in which my practice is that, engaging in philosophy as an ethics of entering into conversation, not assuming I have possession of the truth, but in the hopes that, in faith that truth will emerge through the discussion. And when thinking about the element of practice in the lineage, the philosophical lineage in the West, from Socrates to Schelling and beyond, there have been some criticisms that it lacks. I think Ken Wilber actually points to the German idealists and says they don't have a yoga. They don't have a practice. They're just intellectuals, and they're writing and reading and thinking. And maybe they did realize things through that activity because of some inherent capacity, but they didn't have a practice, and they couldn't. They were professors, Schelling and Hegel and all of the idealists, but it was for them, it may seem overly intellectual and to not be grounded in a practice. On the other hand, if we really look at the whole philosophical tradition, it is a way of life.
It is a yoga.
It is a yoga from another perspective, and I would want to disagree with Wilber about that criticism of Schelling. Schelling was very influenced by Plato, as are all Western philosophers. And if you think about Plato's practice, I would connect it with the Eleusinian mysteries and these sort of initiatory rites that all Greeks participated in, but Plato in particular, being an intellectual and participating in the mystery, was able to share it and sort of articulate it and teach it in a way that non-philosophical initiates weren't able to. And to talk about Eleusis is to talk about what seems to have been a ritualistically contained psychedelic experience. And that, for me personally, psychedelics have certainly been an essential element of my practice, and have revealed things that intellectually I don't even understand, but that sort of are the grounding or the foundation, and the inarticulable foundation of anything I might try to say. Like, I'm always hovering around the ineffable experiences that have been experienced in those states.
That brings my mind back to the connection with plant, even.
Plant.
Connection with plants.
Oh, the flower.
How
Mhm.
consciousness and
Plants
how we have
co-evolve.
companion species,
Yeah.
and they instruct and they bring us into relationship with them through
Right.
being teachers,
Right.
as we humbly approach them.
Yeah. I didn't even notice that that's what I was doing, drawing a flower.
Well,
And I'm glad you
that's
pointed
not
that
a
out.
flower. I like it like that.
I like it like that too, because it really highlights the way in which you have the seed, the flower, and the fruit. So what's the difference between the seed and the fruit, right? Obviously the fruit contains more seeds, so in some ways they're the same, but it's sure, but go with the metaphor. But
Eggs, 1,500 seeds.
yeah, there you go. Thanks. But I mean, the fruit has body, flesh, taste. The seed, nothing. I mean, that's in some ways in potential in the seed, but it's not fleshed out.
Beauty, desire.
Beauty, color, yeah.
That gets back to Adam's question about practice to me, though, like.
Yeah.
And I appreciate Caleb's point, I had the same thought, it is a form of yoga, but it's not obviously embodied. There's a somatic practice that tends to go with Eastern tradition.
Right. Yeah, I mean,
Is that a problem?
probably.
It is.
Because philosophy in academia becomes very disembodied and all about writing texts and responding to texts. Yeah. But the truly great philosophers are more than academics. Like they're concerned with more than just publishing. They're concerned with being in the presence of truth whenever they enter into discourse. And it's not just speech. I mean, it's gesture, And I think that there is, though, a limitation to the Western philosophical tradition, which is that it doesn't emphasize, like in some Buddhist traditions, you have mudra, which, the posture and the gesture of the body, and it's in, Eastern yoga in general, that the body itself is an instrument of communication, and an instrument of realization, and in the
Integration.
And integration. But, Schelling and Hegel, they would go to the natural springs and the baths to sort of be in the presence of some sort of an embodied, meditative event, and it wasn't just like they were obsessed with speaking and intellectualizing.
But here's where I think the embodiment gets tricky, is that words could actually be embodied in the same way that a practice could be an embodiment. And so I think that a lot of these philosophers felt the spirits of words in themselves. Like you can feel a gesture of a word. I mean, I've been meditating on words lately and trying to feel what a response physically is to a word. And so in that sense, I think there is an embodiment, but only if there's an awareness that the words themselves can be embodied. I think otherwise philosophy does contain this craziness, but I think there is a way in which just thought and just words can be an embodiment, but only if you're approaching words from a specific place.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah.
It's an interesting point. I guess I'm just thinking in terms of nurturing by caring for it in the way that there's an obvious nurturance of the intellect.
A lot of philosophers, Schelling, a lot of philosophers don't have kids, they don't get married, it's a very renunciatory path,
Yeah.
Schelling married twice, he didn't have kids, but...
Yeah, I was reading somewhere, was it like most or a large selection?
Oh, sorry, he
of
did
great
have kids,
philosophers
sorry.
Were celibate almost. Not
What just happened?
Schelling had children.
Schelling had kids.
Yeah, he had
Schelling
kids.
just had kids.
Yeah.
But a great percentage of philosophers are
Well, yeah, the
Somewhat
great philosophers were
Monkish.
loners. Kind of.
yeah, didn't have offspring. It was interesting.
Yeah, I got a question for you, and I don't know if it's too specific to Schelling, but I see, just from my reading about Coleridge's philosophy about polarity and duality and such, and can you place Coleridge's philosophy in with Schelling before or after, and has he got the same idea where something branches off and then it's still retaining the same essence as things keep branching off from that? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Well, this picture Schelling gets from that German shoemaker, Boehme. And Coleridge read Boehme before reading Schelling.
The Uma is...
You
does the
can
O
just do
and the E.
BOE if you want,
BOE,
but or you can do that.
Ich vergesse mein Deutsch.
Boehme is very difficult to understand. It's very obscure, and so what Coleridge originally got out of that and what Schelling originally got out of that are not necessarily the same thing. But after Coleridge started to unpack what the nature of Boehme's vision as something more philosophical and even poetic, because he was an interesting combination of a philosopher and a poet. Then Coleridge read Schelling in the first decade of the 19th century. I'm not exactly sure. I don't think anyone is exactly sure. And he's accused of plagiarizing Schelling, translating Schelling's German publications into English without explicitly, he didn't put quotes around it and say Schelling from this essay. He did say earlier, it's in one of his books, the Bibliographia Literaria, where he plagiarizes the most. He says, yeah, I'm drawing from these German philosophers, but he doesn't say that it was word for word. But Coleridge did send his writings to Schelling, and they were in communication with one another later in Coleridge's life. And Schelling didn't mind that Coleridge plagiarized. He thought it was, in the similar way that I was expressing it in Alatheic ethics, that Schelling was fine with being plagiarized so long as the truth was being furthered. So even if it was a theft of his ideas, it's not about that Schelling thought he owned the ideas. So he could have sued Coleridge and probably won, but he didn't really care. He thought Coleridge was brilliant, and he borrowed from Coleridge and gave him credit. But
And how would their understanding of the polarity be different? Or the emergence of polarity?
I would have to struggle to differentiate each of their understandings of polarity. Offhand, I can't think of a crucial difference. Schelling was a better philosopher than Coleridge, and Coleridge was a better poet. Even though all of Coleridge's famous poems were written very early in his life in a 2 to 3 year period, and he never wrote poetry again after that. He just sort of reworked what he'd already written. Coleridge, in some places, does critique Schelling for coming too close to pantheism. But I think Coleridge died, I believe, about 10 or 15 years before Schelling, and then Schelling's later, sort of the last lectures that he gave in an attempt to explicate this. Schelling is careful to say that this isn't pantheism. The crucial issue for Coleridge was, whether or not the creation of the universe is a free act, or whether or not the universe must exist. It is somehow necessary to God's being that there also be this relation to a cosmos, because that would be closer to pantheism. That there's an essential, necessary relationship between God and nature. And Schelling is clear that he wants to preserve that freedom of the act of creation, so that it's more like, that's where you get into panentheism. The panentheism can be defined in many ways, because I think Advaita is panentheistic just as much as Schelling's approach is panentheistic, but there are different ways of characterizing what exactly panentheism is.
I read just briefly, I read somewhere that describing, I don't like this actually, but describing Advaita Vedanta as a cosmic pantheism.
A cosmic pantheism.
A cosmic pantheism. But I struggle to even really understand what that means.
Yeah.
But yeah, it kind of does make sense in a way.
Yeah.
There's no cosmos. It's just God, and everything is God, but there's no cosmos.
In a sense.
That doesn't really help.
Doesn't help.
Experience.
The Mithya thing, though, would militate against that. Cosmos is neither real nor unreal.
Yeah.
The Advaita assumes the truth never changes,
Yeah.
and the unreal never appears. But the world is both appearing and changing. So it's in this kind of in between. It's kind of this in
It
between.
defines truth as
It's
that.
neither
that-
true nor real.
which cannot be negated in past, present, or future, has that specific definition. Whereas the world can be negated because it's coming in and out of existence.
Yeah.
It's not real. It's unreal, but it has that relative existence because it's
it
sharing in
It's
existence.
coming in and out of existence?
Yeah,
It changes.
Yeah, I mean,
We're also not just dealing with the world that's
figurative.
changing, but like there seems to be
As
some
if-
kind of progress.
Because in quantum physics,
More
that's
complexity, like
Yeah.
so
Yeah,
it would be
well-
one thing if it was just a changing world, then it would be like, okay, why, sure, it's just changing its illusion, but where's the Eastern explanation for not
By the way,
just that it's
Advaita and
changing,
East
but
are
that
not
it's changing
identical.
complexity?
It's really important to make that distinction.
Also-
Yeah, we're talking about the difference between perennial and evolutionary ideas, right?
Yeah, I don't think there's any problem though. I've been thinking about it in having there's evolution doesn't cause Vedanta a problem because you just it's the evolution of Mithya. It's not really relevant. I mean, so you can certainly give a more sophisticated account of experience of Mithya, of that order of reality now than then, but it doesn't change the logic. It doesn't change the distinction.
Say that again?
And then let Becca ask her question, because it's been like 5 minutes. Or like finish.
As Mithya describes the order of reality that is space-time, basically. So just having the idea of evolution, the theory of that, doesn't make any difference to that really, because it's of that order of reality. So it's no,
Yeah. As long as Brahman is not evolving,
yeah. So
but the evolution is relative.
Why is the Mithra evolving the way it is?
But it's not a question that Vedanta needs to answer or ask.
I thought that was like the whole point.
Well, it's not there. It's not a systematic metaphysics. First and foremost, it's soteriological. It's like it gives an account of experience, so that you can, understand your position in it in many ways.
What did you call it? Theological?
Soteriological.
I thought it meant salvation.
It does.
Yeah. But
Oh, salvation.
Yeah, it's practical in that sense. Yeah, it's so it's not meant to be. It's not giving any. So this seems like a much more interesting analysis of how Mithya comes about from that perspective.
So this is like, you could say from the Advaita perspective, this is about the birth of Ishvara.
Yeah, I don't see
And
why
that
you
would be
can't say
compatible
that. Yeah.
completely. But that's not what Schelling would want to say.
Yeah.
But it does, you can look at it that way if you're a
You can preserve all of that. You can preserve it
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Becca.
I have 2 questions, but I'm going to hold on to them for a moment. Just one short one was when you said that Advaita is more like Panentheism. How is it more like Panentheism as opposed to Pantheism?
Because
Brahman is everything, and if
Mhm.
God and nature are equal,
Well,
James said there was
there's Atman, which is sort of Brahman in. What is the relationship between Brahman and Atman?
It's not panentheistic because panentheism can certainly describe a feature or an order of that reality, but it's more than that, or further than that, or other than that in some way. Because there's a definite sense that all the statements you make about panentheism, that God is in everything and transcended everything, that's true.
Right.
But it's also other than that.
Right.
So it's not false to say that, but it's definitely false to say that as a description of the position.
Whenever someone asks for a definition of panentheism, I say, well, it's that God is all and God is in all. But then there's a whole discussion that you have to have about what that. Panentheism is always a discussion that's going to go on for a
Is
while.
it God is more than all?
but this is more referring to Pantheism also,
Yeah.
which is what I'm wondering in relation to Advaita. How is it not Pantheism?
Advaita? Because that's a difficult question, really. It's a subtle question, at least, because it's to say that, the simple statement is that whilst the creation is Brahman, is none other than that, Brahman is not creation. They're not identical. There's, as I was saying, there's this, a prayer that you say before each class or whatever, and part of that prayer is, if you take away fullness from fullness, only fullness is left, or if you take away infinity from infinity, only infinity is left. So in that sense, it remains untouched. Whatever it is, the creation does not affect it in any way, and it's independent of that. It has no dependence whatsoever on it. The creation has absolute dependence on it. It's not absolutely clear to me how that works, but that's the way it's explained, and that's the way I understand it. But I think again, it's another one of those points that if you fully understand that, if you can fully say that I understand what that means and say that is to say you see what it is, because it's, all of this is inherently paradoxical and necessarily so, because you're trying to talk about non-duality through duality, and it cannot but be a paradox from duality's perspective.
Mm-hmm. Just to clarify, the simplest definition I would give of panentheism is that all is in God and that God is in all. It's both simultaneously. Not that God is all, that would be pantheism.
That sounds like pantheism too.
Pantheism. God is all?
God is in all things and all things are in God, sounds like pantheism.
Yeah, all things are in
That's
God,
up.
but God,
God, all in God, in, instead of is. So all in God, meaning
Yeah,
God is...
I learned about pantheism in a Vaishnava context where it was like, what is it? Something like, God is in all things, but those things are not in God.
Does God transcend?
But both
God,
the
because
thing,
God transcends the world.
Includes and transcends.
So
That's a subtle difference, but yeah.
that's to me how I, this is
Pan-
Aaron
yeah.
Weiss's panentheism, whatever. I mean, I don't know.
Say what your definition was again?
Well, literally, panentheism, all in God.
Right.
But it's also that God is in all.
Right, and I say that's pantheism. I mean, this is just like a whatever.
which means in some sense
It's a semantic, whatever.
that both the thing and God have a relative independence from each other.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
the cosmos is made out of God, but then God is more
But
than
then
the
God
cosmos.
is more than that.
Yeah.
So with pantheism, it sounds to me like pantheism is like God is all of the stuff in the universe.
Right.
But that's not what Advaita is
It
saying
can
at all.
be, it can actually,
Brahman,
one half of that.
ironically use that in the Venn diagram for it.
Does pantheism include all of the stuff in the universe will become?
This is an
This
anthropology.
is God.
Let's just
Right.
assume that
Yeah,
it does.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't think it actually makes a difference.
Because theism says God is and then creates everything else out of nothing.
I can't.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Did you have another question, Becca, that you didn't
Yeah,
ask?
what was your other question?
I don't like to.
I think it's bringing in too much.
What's it about?
Well, you've already said too much, so please go on.
Well, we can
Too
ignore
late.
it if it is. And just much earlier when you said that Atman equals Brahman, it made me think of yesterday in class with Jake when we were talking about Fichte, and leading into Schelling, A equals A, or God equals God. A equals A, but by saying A equals A doesn't equal A.
Right.
Therefore, A equals B. And I mean, it's convenient that it's A and B and it's Atman and Brahman.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can those be related?
Well, in saying that Atman equals Brahman, all I mean to say by that is that the word Brahman and the word Atman are two different heuristic devices for referring to exactly the same thing depending on a standpoint. So, there's no identity to be made. I mean, it's just the identity is a linguistic identity, but really the equals is not relevant.
Yeah. I mean, Fichte sometimes he's called a subjective idealist because he thought that the whole external world, the whole universe, was just the residue left over after the self posits itself, after A equals A. And that all that the universe is a creation of the I so that the I can interact with itself freely. So the only it's a paradox that I am the absolute subject, but so are all of you. So why is that I would come into relationship to others if the I is all there is? And Fichte would say that the only reason that we have bodies at all and that there is a natural world is so that the I can freely interact with itself. And that all of the complexities of the physical world are a result of the I's needing to be able to come into relationship with itself.
Isn't that what this model is too?
Well,
I had this question the whole time because you brought in otherness, but otherness is not anywhere on this.
Well, otherness is in the Godhead itself already.
Okay, so expand that a little bit for me.
So Schelling was originally considered to be a student of Fichte's and sort of just articulating Fichte's perspective, but they eventually had a break because Schelling started getting into naturphilosophy,
Right.
philosophy of nature, and what you could call an objective idealism. So in other words, instead of starting from the subject and trying to deduce the structure of nature from the structure of the subject, Schelling says, well, what if we reverse it and say that, you know, what if we ask what does the objective world have to be such that the subject is possible, such that subjectivity is possible? So he looked at nature as a given fact of our experience and said, well, what must be underneath this experience? What must be the cause underlying this experience such that my thinking about it is possible? And that led him not to affirm nature's priority over the subjects, or the eyes, the egos, but that led him beyond subjective or objective idealism into what he called early in his career identity philosophy, of the ultimate identity between subject and object. But he didn't stop there. You know, this is Hegel famously and maybe unfairly criticized Schelling by referring to this identity philosophy as the night in which all cows are black, so that there's no distinction, everything is everything.
He made the same critique of Indian philosophy.
Yeah.
Same critique of Indian philosophy, that it's a too easy absolute. It's just, there's no negation, but on the other hand, you could say that Schelling's later critique of Hegel, Schelling lived longer than Hegel and had the last word, was making the same critique on Hegel, that Hegel's absolute was the night in which all cows were black. So, but this is, you know, what happens when you try to language something that is inherently unspeakable and ineffable. But Schelling's final position, final only because he died and couldn't say anymore, is that in some sense the divine is not originally in the possession of full self-knowledge. That the divine...
But more than that the divine is not all there is.
The divine is not all there is, or that non-being is in the divine in some ways. But it's...
But the other is more than just a negation,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Divinity is in... So the simplest explanation of Christianity is God is love. And then you unpack it from there. Well, what is necessary for love to be possible? Relationship. And freedom. Because you need to have not a duality, because there's relationship, but distinction. And that distinction is in the Godhead itself.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the mystery of the Trinity. How do you get unity out of relationship?
And that's lacking then in Advaita Vedanta, the personal nature of divinity, right?
It's not lacking.
Yeah, no, it's there. It's just sharply differentiated from absolute reality.
So, but Brahman's not a personified divinity in the way that, like,
Right.
Christian God is what I mean.
It is personified as Ishvara, but that personification has no reality of its own.
It's relative.
Mm.
But I want it to be real. I want
Well, it is real, just as real as you are.
Yeah.
Create-
Insofar as you take yourself to be you, it's real.
It's Ishvara.
So we have 2 minutes left. If there are any burning questions that we can wrap up so that we don't have to continue this conversation anymore.
Why do we keep trying if it's going to be beyond the possibility? For this?
Why do we keep trying?
It's just
Would
Meaning
you
is
rather talk
play.
about something else?
Fun, right?
I think
play.
meaning is really important to the Christian story, that you're actually increasing meaning and increasing attachment and value and wonder and these things. And
Yeah.
I don't get that sense from the,
Yeah, that's a real point of...
you're actually trying to get rid of
It's
that.
a whole different worldview that comes out of a whole, the Vedic worldview, the Indian worldview. It's just a whole different world.
On the other hand, Schelling wouldn't just want to simply say that he wants to preserve meaning and enchantment in a story. He would also say that nihilism and atheism are a necessary, not just a moment that you pass through, but that like you hold that as a possibility, and only by holding that as a possibility is the meaning that he also wants to articulate even possible, right? So that, you know, evil, for example, is a reality for Schelling. It's not just the absence, it's not the privation of the good, as some theologians try to say, that evil is not, doesn't have its own independent, real existence. Schelling says that that's real, you know?
You know, some vessels are made for noble purposes and some for ignoble purposes. That's scripture.
Mm.
Some things are made
Yeah.
for less than good.
Mm-hmm.
To bring out, and that's what, and sacredness or holiness is things set apart that are different in a good way from
Right.
other things. And so you can't have the sacred nobly without the mundane.
Right.
Or the,
Right.
what's the other word? What's the sacred?
Profane.
Profane,
Yeah.
vulgar.
I think there's one point that needs to be made, and this doesn't have to be the last word or anything. It's just that in this conversation, several times there's been talk about Western versus Eastern attitudes.
Yeah.
And I wish that we would give up that language,
Mm-hmm.
because Advaita Vedanta by no means represents all of India. India by no means represents all of Asia or the East.
Mm-hmm.
Chinese philosophy has nothing to do with this,
Right.
for example. So, and likewise in the West. I mean, nuance, I think, is very important.
Yeah.
Well, how can we distinguish? Because I am feeling it, and whatever you want to call it, I feel a difference between Eastern and Western. What would it say, like rational material
Well,
versus...
The point is that the East, as we characterize it, is, if you're going to use that concept, that there's otherness.
It's like a muscle knot. You massage it, and then you
Yeah.
find out there's lots of things in there.
Right. There's,
That's how East and West are. I mean,
But it's not true that all the Easterns are kind of cyclic and mythic and all the Westerns are kind of rational?
no, absolutely not. Come on, man.
Well, no, but I'm
Don't-
asking you, what is the language to use to describe that if it's not East and West?
Well, then I would say, what is it that you want to accomplish? In this context, we have Burma and Schelling, and we have Advaita as represented by Shankaracharya and Dayananda Saraswati and Carol Whitfield, etc. We can be specific.
Yeah.
And we lose the conversation if we fade into generalities.
Mhm.
That's all. I think it's, yeah.
But there's still some
The essence of East and West depends on what you're trying to do.
monotheism.
That's my point.
yeah.
Versus,
No. There's monotheism in the East and there's polytheism in the West.
Mhm.
Well,
So, I mean, whatever you want, you'll find it. It depends on what you're trying to
Right,
do.
but I think-
So the thing is, if you try to defend a broad, sweeping generalization of East and West, you will eventually learn that that isn't really valid. And check out Orientalism by Edward Said.
Mm.
Yeah, then we can talk more. That shouldn't be the last thing we talk about, but I just think it's really important. If we're doing Asian and comparative studies,
Right.
it's important to take these methodological considerations into account.
Yes. Yeah. There's just as much difference in the East as there is in the West amongst the different lineages which have developed and philosophies which have been articulated. Yeah, it's an important...
Zoroastrianism would be a cool example to check out sometime of like an Eastern system of thinking where the final reality is totally different from the beginning reality.
Yeah.
So we could talk about an evolutionary
I would say that
theism in
influenced by
Zoroastrianism.
West, that Zoroastrianism is geographically enough that it's got some weird...
So there's a line in the sand, literally, between East and West that's geographically located?
There were two evolutionary things that got all mixed up together. And
Yeah.
I granted they're very mixed up.
but we have
Yeah.
an entire department,
East-West.
East-West.
It's East
Like,
dash
Well, and
in
that's
school
one of the
or-
problems with the department. But if you really get into this nuance, I think even the professors in that program would agree with what I'm saying. I know that Jorge would. He's
I totally
definitely
agree with
hip
that.
to post-colonial theory and everything.
Hybridity.
He's definitely aware of this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm not saying we can't use the words, just let's kind of massage that a little bit.
I was using it for ease.
I liked
It's like a
that.
muscle
I
knot.
like that.
Yeah.
The thick mental body work is always a
Yeah.
solid reference to go to, just in general.
That's how I started my day. I always think of it.
Do you guys want to make any concluding points? Do you feel like there's been any?
Tie it all together for us.
Yeah.
I want to hear both sales pitches. Which one am I
This is
gonna go
integral
cooperate with
studies.
Mm-hmm.
Which means
They're the same, but only different?
Same, but different. Yes.
There's, well, I mean, I guess I could just offer one final distinction in that in Advaita, all is the self-same, all is Brahman. And from Schelling's point of view, from the, I'll call it Christian theosophy, just so that there's another term like Advaita Vedanta. From that point of view, there is the self-same identity of the Godhead, and that is in relationship to the self-similar reality of the cosmos. So the different self-same and self-similar, it's the reason that the self-similar is not just the self-same, it's not just identical, but still clearly similar, is that there's this principle of freedom that enters into the cosmos where it doesn't have to develop in the way that God planned it beforehand. And yet it still does, because love wins out over, or that love and freedom somehow merge, or at least enter into this dialogue with one another that leads from the Father to the Son. And that the full realization of freedom and love has to have this process of evolutionary becoming in order to become what it always truly was, but needed time, perhaps, in order to fully manifest as. The seed had to become the fruit. Even though the fruit was in the seed, it had to be given time and space to become the fruit.
Can I ask a really quick question?
Sure.
Is it just a mode of perception? Is it like Schelling is what happens when you look at it from the middle, and
Shankara.
Shankara is what happens when you look at it from the omega point?
Maybe.
It's just it's perspective. It's not like we're talking about two different things. It's just
Perspective
from
is
where
definitely a
you
big
look at
thing.
it.
That's an interesting.
Right.
I like that a lot.
That's
Yeah.
really interesting. From the Omega point,
Right, from the omega point.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all being, the
Mhm.
Upanishads are written from, from that place, from self-knowledge.
I mean,
That's why they
yeah.
revealed knowledge.
The Gospel
Yeah.
of John, it's that the Son was in the beginning.
Yeah.
And always has been. Right? So that there's...
Did you say the daughter was in the beginning?
Yeah. Well, Mother, Daughter, and
well, the
Holy
Logos
Soul.
in the beginning was
is-
the Word.
yeah.
In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was
Right.
God.
Exactly. That's the accurate quotation. The Logos, yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone. That was fun.
This video's gonna go
Yeah, now it's going to become the fucking
now. Never gonna get a
Yeah,
job.
likewise.
Shit.
Never gonna get a job.
I didn't realize it was video.
Oh, yeah.
I think so.
You didn't do anything to
It would be cool if, like, it all gives her a
No one knew.